At RAF Binbrook in Lincolnshire, on a damp morning in May 1974, a USAF major named Charles O'Neill walked across the apron towards a slate-grey English Electric Lightning F6 XR728 and stopped to look at it the way a horseman looks at a thoroughbred he has not yet ridden. Neil had flown the F4 Phantom in Vietnam. He had flown the F-15 Eagle in its earliest evaluation form. He had been seconded to No. 11 Squadron RAF under the long-running exchange program that placed American pilots in British air defense units and British pilots in American ones. An arrangement quietly run through the Air Ministry and, after 1964, the Ministry of Defense. The Lightning he was looking at had two Rolls-Royce Avon 301R engines stacked one above the other, an arrangement no other frontline fighter in the world used, and a thrust-to-weight ratio close to unity on a clean airframe. The exchange pilots wrote letters home. They wrote reports for Tactical Air Command. They wrote eventually articles for service journals, and what they wrote travelled, by diplomatic bag and by telex to the Pentagon, to RAF Strike Command at High Wycombe, and into the assessment files that the Joint Intelligence Committee in Whitehall used to gauge how British defence equipment was viewed by the only ally that mattered. The reports were not, on the whole, what the air staff had expected. The American pilots did not write that the Lightning was obsolete, which by 1974 it arguably was. They wrote that it climbed faster than anything they had strapped into. They wrote that from brakes off it could be at 36,000 feet inside 2.5 minutes. They wrote that in a vertical scissors against an F4, the Lightning 1, and that the F4 crew usually did not understand what had happened to them. This was awkward. The Lightning had been conceived in the late 1940s as a research aircraft, the English Electric P.1, and dragged into service in 1959 as a stopgap interceptor while the air staff waited for something better. The Sandys White Paper of 1957 had declared in language the Royal Air Force never forgave that the manned fighter was nearing the end of its useful life, and that surface-to-air missiles would do the job henceforth. The Lightning was on paper the last of a dying breed. Its replacement, the BACT-SR-2, had been cancelled by the Wilson government in April 1965. Its intended successor in the interceptor role, the F-111K, had been cancelled in 1968. By the time Neil arrived at Binbrook, the Lightning was meant to be on borrowed time, with the Phantom FGR.2 already in service, and the Tornado ADV still a decade away. And the Americans flying it were saying it was the best pure interceptor they had ever touched. The intelligence implication was not lost on the Defence Operational Analysis Establishment at West Byfleet, which compiled comparative performance assessments for the MOD throughout the 1970s. If exchange pilots from the United States Air Force, an air arm that operated the F-15 from 1976, were filing reports describing the Lightning's acceleration, climb and short-range combat performance in the terms they were using, then the question that arose in Whitehall was not whether the aircraft should be retired. The question was what the Soviets, who had been tracking Lightnings over the North Sea for 15 years from their Tu-95 Bear reconnaissance flights, actually thought they were looking at. The answer to that question began to emerge from an entirely different direction. The Bear flights came down the Norwegian Sea in pairs, sometimes singly, from Olenja on the Kola Peninsula, tracking southwest towards the Iceland-Faroes Gap, and then turning east into the North Sea air defence region. They had been doing this since the early 1960s, and the standard British response was a pair of Lightnings, scrambled from Leuchars in Fife, or, after 1968, from Binbrook, climbing on full reheat to intercept the intruders somewhere over the cold water between the Shetlands and Bergen. The intercepts were photographed by the Lightning pilots using a handheld camera braced against the canopy, and the photographs were filed at Headquarters No. 11 Group at Bentley Priory before being passed to the Defence Intelligence Staff in the MOD main building. A Bear flight on March 24, 1971 produced an exchange that the RAF Historical Branch later acknowledged as routine but that the pilots involved remembered as instructive. The Lightning, flown by a flight lieutenant of No. 23 Squadron, pulled alongside the Tu-95 at 32,000 feet, held station for the photograph, and then, in response to a hand signal from the Soviet co-pilot, performed a slow roll around the bomber's longitudinal axis before peeling away. The Soviet crew, on returning to Olenia, would have been debriefed by GRU air intelligence officers, and the British knew this because GCHQ at Cheltenham had been reading the relevant Soviet long-range aviation traffic since the late 1960s under arrangements that ultimately fed into the UK-USA agreement. What the Soviets thought of the Lightning is harder to document, but the indirect evidence is consistent. Soviet PVO Strany doctrine, the air defense forces tasked with intercepting Western bombers, was built around aircraft of broadly similar conception to the Lightning. Short-legged, fast-climbing, missile-armed point defense fighters. The MiG-25 Foxbat, which entered service in 1970, was the most extreme expression of this philosophy. The Lightning, although older, occupied the same conceptual space, and Soviet pilots who encountered it over the North Sea were encountering a Western counterpart to their own thinking, not a Western alternative to it. The Foxbat could fly faster and higher. The Lightning could accelerate and turn more sharply at the altitudes where engagements actually occurred. Both were, in the brutal logic of point defense, doing the same job. The Joint Intelligence Committee, chaired through most of the 1970s by Sir Anthony Duff and then by Sir Anthony Ackland, took an interest in Soviet assessments of British equipment because such assessments fed into deterrence calculations. A Soviet planner who believed the Lightning could reliably intercept a Tu-95 carrying a Kh-20 standoff missile before it reached weapons release range would build that belief into his targeting calculus. The same planner would discount the Lightning if he believed it could not. GCHQ collection on Soviet long-range aviation training exercises, recovered through signals intelligence over a period of years, suggested that the Soviets respected the Lightning more than the available Western press coverage of the aircraft would have implied. The Americans noticed the discrepancy. In 1972, the United States Air Force began the Air Combat Evaluation Program, which became Red Flag, and the exchange officer system suddenly mattered more than it had in 20 years. Reports filed by USAF pilots flying with the RAF on the Lightning, the Phantom FGR.2, and later the Buccaneer were collated by the Air Force Systems Command and circulated within the Pentagon as primary source material on British capabilities. One of those reports, written in 1974, was about to cause an argument inside Tactical Air Command that historians have only partially reconstructed. Major Bill Schaffner is not the pilot the report was about, but his name has to be mentioned because the Schaffner case from September 1970, in which a USAF exchange pilot, flying a Lightning from RAF Binbrook, disappeared over the North Sea in disputed circumstances, has coloured every subsequent account of Anglo-American Lightning operations. The Board of Inquiry findings were partially released by the MOD in 2002. Schaffner's death is not the subject of the present account, but his presence on No. 5 Squadron's strength in 1970 establishes that USAF pilots were flying the Lightning operationally, not as visitors by the time the comparisons with American hardware began to be drawn in writing. The 1974 report that mattered was written by a different officer and concerned a series of dissimilar air combat training sorties flown out of Binbrook in the spring of that year against Phantoms of number of 43 Squadron from Luchars and, on at least one occasion that summer, against USAF F-4Es operating out of RAF Lakenheath under USAFE. The exercises were not formal evaluations, they were squadron-level workups conducted under the supervision of the Air Officer commanding No. 11 Group, and the reports filed afterwards went to the Central Tactics and Trials Organisation at RAF West Raynham before being archived. What the USAF exchange officer recorded, and what circulated subsequently within Tactical Air Command, was a series of specific tactical observations. The Lightning, on internal fuel and clean of the overwing ferry tanks, accelerated from 450 to 600 knots at low level in a time the F-4 could not match. In the vertical, the Lightning's combined thrust from its two Avons and its low wing loading gave it a climb performance that allowed it to disengage upwards from a Phantom and re-engage from above before the Phantom crew could re-establish situational awareness. The political problem this caused was specific. The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II was, in 1974, the frontline fighter of the United States Air Force, the United States Navy, the United States Marine Corps, the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy, and the air arms of half a dozen NATO allies. It had cost the American taxpayer billions of dollars across its development and production. The suggestion that a British aircraft designed in the early 1950s and in service since 1959 could outperform it in any meaningful combat parameter was not the kind of suggestion the Pentagon wished to see, circulating in the year that the F-15 Eagle was being readied for initial operational capability with the first tactical fighter wing at Langley. The response within Tactical Air Command was a quiet effort to characterize the reports as the product of unusual circumstances. The Lightning, it was pointed out, had a combat radius of perhaps 150 nautical miles on internal fuel. It carried two Red Top or Firestreak missiles, infrared guided weapons of 1950s vintage that were of limited utility against a target taking evasive action. Its radar, the Ferranti AI.23 Airpass, was a monopulse set with a search range against a bomber-sized target of about 40 nautical miles, which was respectable in 1960 and obsolescent by 1974. The Phantom, by contrast, had AIM-7 Sparrow semi-active radar homing missiles, AIM-9 Sidewinders, an internal Vulcan cannon in the F-4E version, the AN/APQ-12O radar with longer detection range, and the legs to fly across the North Atlantic on internal fuel with aerial refueling. All of which was true, none of which addressed the central observation in the exchange officer's report. The Lightning, in the visual range high-energy fight that the USAF had spent the previous 5 years in Vietnam, learning that it was actually going to have to win, was a problem. The Vietnam dimension is what makes the timing of the 1974 reports significant. Operation Linebacker II, the 11-day bombing campaign over North Vietnam in December 1972, had concluded with the USAF having lost 15 B-52 Stratofortresses to North Vietnamese surface-to-air missiles. The air-to-air loss exchange ratio against MiG-21s flown by Vietnamese People's Air Force pilots had been throughout the war embarrassingly close to even despite American advantages in numbers, technology, and pilot hours. The cause, as identified by the Alt report of 1968 and the subsequent Red Baron studies, was that American fighter pilots had forgotten how to dogfight. They had been trained since the late 1950s to fire beyond visual range missiles at targets identified by ground or airborne radar controllers. They had not been trained to maneuver against an opponent visible through the canopy. The Royal Air Force had reached different conclusions. The Lightning had been built for visual range interception, partly because that was what its airframe and engine layout made it good at, and partly because RAF Fighter Command and its successor Strike Command had never accepted the Sandys doctrine that the manned fighter was finished. Lightning pilots at Binbrook and at No. 5 and No. 11 squadrons flew dissimilar air combat against Phantoms, Buccaneers and visiting USAF aircraft on a regular basis throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s. They flew it hard, the accident rate was high. The Lightning suffered a Category 5 write-off rate of approximately 1 airframe per 11,000 flying hours over its service life, considerably worse than the Phantom. The pilots who survived the training were, by 1974, among the most experienced close combat fighter pilots in NATO. The USAF exchange officer who flew with No. 11 Squadron in 1974 and the small number of his colleagues who flew with No. 5 Squadron came to Binbrook fresh from the Vietnam experience. They had flown F-4s against MiGs at Udon and Ubon. They had survived. They were not, on the whole, sentimentalists, and the reports they filed were not advocacy documents. They were tactical assessments of what the Lightning could and could not do, set against what the USAF needed its next generation of fighters to be able to do. The F-15 Eagle, then in flight test at Edwards Air Force Base and approaching delivery, had been specified after the Alt report to be a pure air superiority fighter with a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1, a low wing loading, an internal cannon, and an emphasis on close combat maneuverability. The specification looked in many respects like a Lightning with longer legs, better radar, and modern missiles. This was not, the Air Force Systems Command insisted, a coincidence, because both aircraft had been designed against the same fundamental physics of air-to-air combat. It was nevertheless an awkward family resemblance, particularly when exchange officers' reports kept describing how the older British aircraft was, in certain narrow parameters, doing things the F-15 was being designed to do. What the British made of this is recorded indirectly in the surviving Air Staff papers at the National Archives at Kew in the AIR-8 and AIR-20 series. Air Marshal Sir Dennis Smallwood, AOC in Sea Strike Command, from 1974 to 1976, was sufficiently aware of the comparative reports to mention them, in passing, in his retirement papers. The MOD did not, of course, base procurement decisions on the question of whether British aircraft impressed American pilots. The Lightning was being run on for as long as the Tornado ADV development program required, and not a day longer. The aircraft retired from frontline service in 1988, but the reports kept being written and they kept arriving in Washington. The Pentagon did not, on the whole, like the reports. This was not a matter of inter-service vanity, although there was an element of that. It was a matter of what the reports implied about the procurement choices the United States Air Force had made in the previous 15 years. If a British interceptor designed in 1949 could, in 1974, outperform the F-4 in the visual range fight, then the F-4 was either not what the USAF had been told it was, or the parameters of the visual range fight were not what the USAF had been training to. Either conclusion was uncomfortable. The first implied that McDonnell Douglas had sold the Air Force an aircraft that was less capable than its advertised specifications. The second implied that Air Training Command had spent 15 years teaching American pilots the wrong skills. Both conclusions were, by 1974, partially correct, and the USAF was already in the process of acting on them. The Aggressor program, established at Nellis Air Force Base in 1972, paired American pilots in F-5E Tiger IIs against frontline squadrons in dissimilar air combat training, on the principle that the only way to learn to fight a smaller, more maneuverable opponent was to fight a smaller, more maneuverable opponent. The Top Gun School at Miramar, established by the Navy in 1969, had pioneered the technique. The F-15 had been designed in part to ensure that the next generation of American fighter pilots would not have to relearn the lessons of Vietnam from scratch. The exchange officer reports from Binbrook fed into this rethinking, though they were never the primary input. They were corroborating evidence. They said in effect that what the aggressors and Top Gun were teaching about close-in combat was correct, and that an aircraft designed 20 years earlier to do precisely that job could still embarrass a contemporary American fighter in the right circumstances. The Air Force Systems Command read the reports. The Tactical Air Command read the reports. Officers in both commands argued about what the reports meant. The argument that mattered was conducted in essence by silence. The Pentagon did not publicly acknowledge the comparative findings. The RAF did not publicly trumpet them. The exchange continued. American pilots flew Lightnings, British pilots flew F-4s and eventually F-15s on detachment to USAFE bases. The reports went into the files and the files went into the archives, and the lessons were absorbed into doctrine on both sides without ever being formally identified as having come from the Lightning experience. The British government throughout this period was not interested in fighter aerobatics. It was interested in two things: The first was the survival of British aerospace as an industry capable of designing and manufacturing frontline combat aircraft, which by the mid-1970s required collaboration with European partners on what would become the Tornado and later the Typhoon. The second was the continued credibility of the British contribution to NATO air defence, which required that the Lightning hold the line until the Phantom and then the Tornado ADV could take over. The exchange officer reports served both purposes. They confirmed to the Americans that British equipment was taken seriously by American pilots. They confirmed to the British that the investment in the Lightning had not been wasted. They demonstrated to the Soviets through whatever channels Soviet intelligence used to read American assessments of British capabilities that the North Sea air defence region was being patrolled by an aircraft that the United States Air Force took seriously enough to write detailed reports about. This last point was the one that mattered most in Whitehall. The deterrence value of an air defence system is measured not in the performance of the aircraft, but in the calculation of the adversary planner. Air Chief Marshal Sir Andrew Humphrey, Chief of the Air Staff from 1974 to 1976, and Chief of the Defence Staff from 1976 until his sudden death in January 1977, understood this distinction clearly. The Lightning in 1974 was not the aircraft that would defend British airspace against a Soviet bomber attack in 1985. The Tornado ADV would do that when it entered service. The Lightning was the aircraft that had to convince the Soviet Long-Range Aviation Command in 1974 that a successful bomber strike against the United Kingdom was not a calculation a sensible planner would make. The Joint Intelligence Committee assessment circulated in the spring of 1974, JYC 7416, addressed Soviet capabilities against the United Kingdom air defence region. The assessment was the responsibility of the Defence Intelligence Staff, with input from GCHQ on signals intelligence and from the Secret Intelligence Service on agent-derived material from Soviet aviation circles. The assessment concluded in language that was characteristically cautious that Soviet planners assessed the United Kingdom's air defences as a significant operational problem, particularly given the geometric difficulty of approaching the British Isles without being detected by the Iceland-based or Norwegian-based NATO radar coverage. The Lightning in this assessment mattered for what it would do in the last 100 miles of a Soviet bomber's approach. The Bear and the Badger, the two principal Soviet long-range aviation aircraft of the period, both carried air-to-surface missiles designed to be launched from outside the range of point defence interceptors. The KH-22 carried by the Tu-22M backfire from the mid-1970s had a range of around 250 nautical miles. The Lightning, with its limited combat radius, could not intercept a backfire before it launched a KH-22, but it could intercept the KH-22 after launch, which was a different and arguably more important problem. The exchange officer reports in the round suggested that the Lightning was capable of doing this. Its acceleration and climb gave it the energy to engage a transonic cruise missile in its terminal phase. Its red-top missile, although infrared-guided, had a forward aspect engagement capability against a hot target that other Western infrared missiles of the period lacked. The combination, although not advertised in those terms, gave the United Kingdom air defence region a credible counter-air-launched cruise missile capability at a time when no other NATO air force had thought systematically about the problem. This was the strategic point that the JIC, the MOD, and ultimately the Cabinet Office understood, and that the American reports inadvertently corroborated. The Lightning was not the world's best fighter in 1974. It was, however, the world's best aircraft for a specific and narrow mission: the high-speed interception of incoming targets at medium altitude over the North Sea. The fact that USAF exchange pilots, on returning to American service, wrote reports describing the aircraft in terms that surprised their Pentagon readers was a useful byproduct of the British defence posture. But it was not the point of it. The point was that the Soviets believed it. The signals intelligence collected by GCHQ on Soviet long-range aviation training exercises in the mid-1970s suggested that they did. Tu-95 routes shifted marginally but measurably to give the Lightning's intercept envelope a wider berth. Soviet aircrew in radio traffic that was decrypted at Cheltenham and circulated in summary form to the Joint Intelligence Committee referred to the British interceptor with the particular caution that experienced pilots use when discussing an adversary they have not yet outmaneuvered. In Whitehall, that was the only measure of the aircraft that ultimately counted. Margaret Thatcher's government, on taking office in May 1979, inherited a defence posture in which the Lightning was approaching the end of its service life. The 1981 Defence Review, conducted by John Nott as Secretary of State for Defence, did not address the Lightning directly. Nott's review was concerned with the structure of British forces in the round, with the contraction of the surface fleet and the priority given to the strategic nuclear deterrent. The Lightning's retirement was managed within the Royal Air Force as an internal scheduling matter, governed by the delivery rate of the Tornado ADV from BAE Wharton. The Falklands War in 1982 changed nothing for the Lightning, which was not deployed, but it changed everything for the assumptions underlying British air defence. The Argentine Air Force had used French Mirage 3s and Israeli-supplied daggers against the Royal Navy with sufficient effect to sink 5 British ships and damage many more. The Sea Harriers of No. 800, No. 801 and No. 809 naval air squadrons had performed well against them, but the engagement geometry had been particular to the South Atlantic and to the limitations of carrier-based air defence at extreme range. The wider lesson absorbed by the Air Staff and by the MOD's Operational Requirements Branch was that fighter performance in the close-in fight remained as important in 1982 as it had been in 1972. The Tornado F.2 entered service with No. 229 Operational Conversion Unit at Coningsby in November 1984. The Tornado F.3, the definitive interceptor variant, followed in 1986. The Lightning was withdrawn from frontline service in April 1988, with No. 11 Squadron at Binbrook, the last operational unit. The disbandment parade was held on June 30th, 1988. Air Chief Marshal Sir Patrick Hine, AOC in Sea Strike Command, took the salute. The American pilots who had flown the aircraft on exchange were, by then, senior officers in the United States Air Force. Some had risen to command of wings and groups. The lessons they had drawn from Binbrook had been absorbed into the curriculum of the Air Force Fighter Weapons School at Nellis, where instructors taught visual range combat tactics that owed, in their fundamentals, something to the British experience of operating an aircraft built around the proposition that the fight would be visual, vertical, and fast. The Lightning's combat record, in the strict sense, was nil. The aircraft never fired a missile in anger. It intercepted Soviet bombers approaching British airspace on more than 300 occasions between 1962 and 1988, and on each occasion the Soviet aircraft turned away short of British airspace, or completed its reconnaissance run under escort and departed. The deterrence had held, whether it had held because of the Lightning or because of the wider NATO air defence architecture, is a question that historians including Peter Hennessy and Richard Aldrich have addressed with appropriate caution. The aircraft was a component of a system. Its contribution to the system was real, but not separable. What the Pentagon reports had demonstrated in 1974 and in the years following was that the system worked because the components were taken seriously by adversaries and allies alike. A British aircraft that impressed American pilots was, by extension, a British aircraft that worried Soviet planners. The chain of inference was not direct. It did not need to be. The credibility of the United Kingdom's air defence posture was constituted, in part, by the credibility of its individual components, and the Lightning, for all its limitations of range and avionics, was a credible component. The classified files at Q, declassified in stages from the late 1990s onwards, allow much of the story to be reconstructed. The story does not have a tidy ending because the Cold War did not end tidily, and the Lightning did not retire tidily. The aircraft's withdrawal from Binbrook in 1988 took place against the background of Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in Washington in December 1987, and the slow recognition in Whitehall that the Soviet threat against which the Lightning had been built was diminishing in ways that no one in 1974 had foreseen. The Tornado F-3 took over the air defense task. The exchange officer program continued. American pilots flew Tornadoes. British pilots flew F-15S and F-16S. The reports from Binbrook in the 1970s were declassified by the United States Air Force in stages from the mid-1990s onwards, under standard declassification timetables. They were not sensational documents. They were technical assessments, written in the dry prose of Air Force flying evaluations, and the reactions they had provoked in the Pentagon at the time were not recorded in the documents themselves, but in the recollections of officers who had read them. Those recollections, gathered by aviation historians including Roger Beaumont and, in the British context, Chris Pocock, formed the basis of subsequent published accounts. The picture that emerges from the American documents and the British files together is of an aircraft that did its job and was respected by those who flew it on both sides of the Atlantic. The Pentagon was not in the end shocked by the Lightning. It was puzzled by it, and then it absorbed the puzzle into the larger reassessment of fighter design and tactics that produced the F-15, the F-16, and the doctrine they embodied. The British contribution to that reassessment was not decisive, but it was present, and it was acknowledged within the relevant communities at the time and afterwards. The aircraft itself survives in a handful of museum examples. XR-728, the aircraft Major Neal walked towards on that May morning in 1974, is preserved by the Lightning Preservation Group at Bruntingthorpe in Leicestershire, kept in running condition with its avons, periodically lit for fast taxi runs along the airfield's main runway. The aircraft does not fly. The Civil Aviation Authority has not licensed a Lightning for civil flight in the United Kingdom since the 1990s, and the last airworthy examples, operated by Thunder City in South Africa, were grounded after a fatal accident in November 2009. The Lightning's flying career, in practical terms, ended with the disbandment of No. 11 Squadron at Binbrook in 1988. The strategic context in which the Lightning had been built and operated dissolved over the 3 years that followed. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. The Warsaw Pact dissolved in July 1991. The Soviet Union itself was dissolved in December 1991 by the Belavesia Accords and the subsequent resignation of Gorbachev. The North Sea air defense region, against which the Lightning had been measured for 30 years, ceased to be the front line of anything. The Tornado F-3 squadrons that had inherited the Lightning's task were themselves replaced in the early 2000s by the Typhoon, an aircraft whose design owed something in its emphasis on high thrust-to-weight ratio and close combat agility to the British operational experience of the Lightning years. The records remain. The exchange officer reports are in the United States National Archives at College Park, Maryland. The British operational papers are at Kew. The recollections of the pilots, gathered by oral historians attached to the Imperial War Museum and the RAF Historical Branch, are catalogued and accessible. What they describe between them is a small but particular episode in the technical history of the Cold War. The moment when American pilots flew a British aircraft and found themselves writing reports that contradicted the prevailing assumptions about what British aerospace could produce. The shock, such as it was, faded. The reports remained.